Thanks, Stacy. My name is Ivory Williams. I am a senior designer at a place called the Helix Centre, which is a design studio at St Mary's Hospital in Paddington. And it's a design studio embedded into a hospital where we deal and tackle some of the most complex health needs in the service, which range from pediatric safety to end-of-life care, where I work. I also am one of the co-founders of Humane Engineering, which I think was one of the slides there, where we create Cove, which Stacy pointed out is a music maker primarily for grieving adolescents. And I also kind of lead a design and research studio called Being and Dying, so where a lot of this kind of work is kind of stemmed from originally. So I'm going to spend about 5 minutes just kind of going through a couple of ideas, and really, hopefully it'll set up everyone else who's going to follow, but it's kind of a high level kind of a point, really, that death is about power and perspective. So who has power over death, and how do they view it, and how has it changed over time? So I'm just going to quickly set up some ideas and see how we've done things in the past and how we might be doing things in the future. So, since the early 19th century until now, the doctor really has been the expert in death. You know, they have all the knowledge, they have all the power. They control the experience, the coordination, the pain relief, the insight to knowing what is best. Doctors look over us with this kind of clinical gaze. They see the reality of our situation. They look at us as a collection of diseases. They diagnose us, they test on us, they place us on pathways with care packages, and we entrust them to see things as they actually are and organize it for us. So they guide us as we die with medicalized treatment, which you could argue is now over-medicalized. But they provide palliation from suffering. There's no need to really suffer nowadays, although of course it varies. And in fact, heaven is essentially a reliable stream of morphine. Pain relief and the religious experience therefore causes a point of tension. But even so, they're in such control that assisted dying is legal in a lot of countries, be it the ethics of it, it's still true. And care for the dying is really, in this sense, kind of taken in those last weeks, those last days, those hours, and they're kind of defined by questions. So, is it a good death? Is it a bad death? Are you lucid? Are you in pain? Is it all going to plan, or is it all gone and fallen apart? But before the doctor, before the 19th century, the priest was the expert in death. They had all the knowledge, and they had all the power. So death as an experience was really controlled by them, and through the priest's sacred gaze, God looked over us. But the priests, they guided us as we died with ritualistic practices, so rituals of prayers and offerings to help bridge the gap between this life and the next. And they'd force us to reckon with our pain because it was really necessary for salvation, because through God, through our pain, they promised peace and rest. And because the world was brutal, it was painful, they said, don't be afraid, heaven is waiting for you and you're going to be a lot happier there. And so this experience of death was both romantic and mystic, but also really everyday. It was really defined by simple answers, but it was ultimately unknowable. Death as an experience was focused on the next life, what comes next, but we really can't see. But soon, and we're definitely seeing signs today, as you can see from Stacy's slides, like the individual is going to become the expert in death, not the doctor or the priest. So we are going to all look at the experience of dying ourselves with what I call the designer's gaze. I say this not to sort of compare designers to priests and doctors at all, but really to say that designers view themselves as the newest addition to this bedside experience, and we'll all eventually adopt this viewpoint. Basically, we're starting to design our deaths to suit our own preferences and attitudes, and that's obviously quite self-evident. As designers, we use human-centered design to promote and improve patient-centered care. But design will continue to create more personal experiences based on our own relationships with people, about other people we care about and all those around us. And it's the individual that have the position of power, because the patient, again, is the expert. Death will be seen from our own internal perspective, not an external perspective from the doctor or the priest. And so we're starting to be guided by these sort of techno-ritual practices that reinforce this. We've seen some already from Stacy. But Simon Scott, live tweeting his mother's death in 2013, I think is a really classic example of what this means. So through technology, we all experience death, but individually. It's intimate and it's immediate, but the key is dissolving the actual appearance of technology beyond digital interfaces and physical products to the affordance of technology itself. Like, how will it change the act and the art of dying? And so the individual uses design as a tool, unlike the priest with the Bible or the doctor with a syringe. And he can change the way that we die entirely to create a hyper-personalized and four-dimensional death. So hyper-personal in that the construction of elements, be them physical or digital, will be tailored to specific needs and desires. Now, it might look like a traditional 20th century funeral with everything that comes with it, or it might equally utilize bleeding edge ideas and processes to dying and burial and memorial. But the point being is that we will all construct our own to suit what we want. And so, and also this emergence of a fourth dimensional version of ourselves is really interesting because it transcends physical space. It means that we can foster and build these hyper-personalized versions of ourselves that live on indefinitely. They'll continue and this will continue with the design and management of these versions of ourselves that is really starting only to be understood right now. But the point is we'll do it knowingly. So as Laura Huxley said to her husband Aldous when he was dying in 1963, she whispered in his ear as he was lying in his bed that you are doing this willingly and consciously and beautifully. Thanks.
So I'll go back. I'm a doctor. I started off as a GP and then I became interested in how people die. And I've worked mainly in the hospice sector for about 20 years. And I'm now working back in hospital. And I've also got a national role at a charity called Hospice UK, exploring how death could be better in all settings, hospital, hospice, home, care home, wherever. And I just wanted to start off, I've only got 5 minutes. What do you think the average age is in this audience? Guess. 35, 25? 35. Okay, that's awkward. I'm going to make it 30. If there's 60 people here, how much life experience have we got in the room? 60 times 30, we've got 1,800 years of life experience. I did that without my iPhone. Oops. So, 1,800 years of life experience. I wonder how much death experience we've got in the room. Now, and also I wanted to say a health warning at the start that we might be triggering some sad memories, so hopefully we won't cause too much distress. But I just wondered how many people have ever sat at the bedside of a dying person? Okay, that's really interesting, quite a lot of you. How many people have sat at the bedside of 3 dying people? You must all work in a hospice. Are you nurses? Okay, 10 dying people. 50. Okay. Palliative care nurses. Okay.
You get the prize later.
So the point of that is we have much more life experience than death experience. And as Ivor says, for me, death has sort of disappeared from society. It's been segregated into institutions like hospitals, hospices and care homes. And most people, you're an unusual bunch, most people don't actually see the process of dying or a dead body until well into their 40s or 50s, when our parents die. So if we are going to move to an individualised death, we don't have much rehearsal for it of what matters to us. So I'm quite interested in that, and thank you for the 3 different gazes. But one of the things that struck me is that we do believe we are immortal. And this was a banner at a Canadian conference that I went to last year, and an American came up and he said, "Thank goodness I live in the States." It was a very funny moment. He really said that. So, and I'm really curious that that we seem to be designed, although we fear death, and death anxiety is something that I know all of the panel are interested in and we haven't got time to go into, but we seem to find various ways to convince ourselves of our immortality, which prevents good endings and good planning and good thinking. And that's a great shame. This is a 91-year-old guy on a skateboard. There are 90-year-olds running marathons and things. We can keep the body going. And I was struck the other day when I was in the Royal Marsden Hospital where I work, which is a cancer hospital. A 95-year-old man had recently been diagnosed with cancer of the pancreas, and I was asked to see him because he had some pain. And his first question to me was, "Why me?" And I was so gobsmacked that he thought at 95 he could escape death or something serious. But I think that's one of the struggles that we're living with. So until we dispel the myths of immortality and come to terms with using our life well, then we'll miss a lot of opportunities. I'm just going to put my glasses on so I don't miss out some key messages. So medicine is partly to blame, and one of my learnings from moving from the hospice to the hospital is when I worked in the hospice, I used to blame oncologists and doctors, other specialists, for not having conversations earlier enough about the fact that people were dying and what did they want to do with that time to make best use of it. But actually working in hospital, I see it's not just the doctors, it's the power of medicine, but it's also the expectations of patients. And now we can replace almost any body part apart from your brain. We can unblock tubes, you can replace lungs, livers, bowels, there are bowel transplants, hearts, as you know, legs, hands, and I read about a face transplant recently. So we can be kept going. Bits of us can be kept going, but that leads to a very fragmented approach to the person. This is a pair of ceramic lungs. I was at an amazing conference last week where an Irish ceramic artist wanted to capture and remember her grandfather's struggle with lung disease, and she created a lot of beautiful things, but these lungs really stood out for me. So medicine has become bewildering, and our response, and that very first slide that Ivor showed of people dying with an entanglement of tubes and machines, is very, very common. And people do, maybe life is too exciting, which is why we don't want to leave it. Heaven doesn't have much appeal because we can actually address quite a lot of suffering on this earth, so that's made me think quite a lot. But actually, immortality isn't a great idea. You need to stop me at 5 minutes, else I'll prattle on. Okay. I was at a meeting recently, with a public meeting, where I gave, there were 100 people there, 10 tables of 10, and I gave everybody a prognosis. So one table was going to live for 3 weeks, one table was going to live for a year, one table was going to live forever, and one table was going to live a few days. And the table who were given the forever prognosis really, really didn't like it. They said, none of us want to live forever apart from Bill, who was sitting on the table. What they said, they said, what we want is to be pain-free, to be where we want to be with the people we want to be. Quite simple. And they sort of captured years of research. So there's some fairly fundamental things, but I think the possibility of individualizing death is here. And I suppose what I spend most of my time doing is having quite tricky conversations with people about their prognosis and then trying to establish work with them about how to best use that time and how we can support those wishes.
Perhaps it's a kind of good transition point.
Yes, that's fine.
The...
I think everything else can wait till the panel. Okay. Shall I transition now, or shall I?
John can come up and you can kind of finish the last kind of slide off.
My last slide is an event in May for those who are interested, but I can talk a bit more about that later. Okay. Thank you.
Apologies, we're trying to keep everyone quite tightly to time so we can have loads of questions from you guys, because we know that there's lots of exciting things that you possibly want to ask.
Ready?
Yeah, go
Okay, very good.
Sorry.
All right. So good evening, everyone. It's great to see everyone here. And I would just like to take a moment to congratulate Stacy on completing her PhD. Get a round of applause. It has been... I've known Stacy. Now we're going to bring out the cake. I've known Stacy since she was just starting her PhD, I think, wasn't it?
Since the first email I sent to you was the end of my undergraduate.
End of you? Oh man, I'm old. Okay. Anyway, so I've known Stacy since that time, and it's been great to watch someone work on a project around death and dying from both its very early inception all the way through to PhD and a great gig, here at Greenwich. So well done. My name is John Troyer. I'm the director of the Center for Death and Society, and I feel like most of you have seen me talk before, which is fine because it seems like I'm always talking about death. And I've been at the University of Bath for 8.5 years. I'm not from Bath originally, in case you can't tell. I'm from the great state of Wisconsin in the northern part of the states, from a small town named Hudson, Wisconsin. And came to Bath for the job. The most important biographical detail, I'll just say this, I wasn't even going to say it, but I'll say it now because we were talking about it earlier, is that my father was a funeral director, so I grew up in the funeral industry. Yeah, you see, I don't say it because then you're like, oh, now we get it. Like, we totally get it. We see what happened, and it was not the plan, I swear. And my background it never is, no. And the least of which I was getting up in Bath, England. What? Like, to me, Bath was like this reference point in Chaucer. Anyway, so the work I've done, and actually how I ended up doing what I do, and ended up being director of the Center for Death and Society, the world's only interdisciplinary study center around death, dying, and the dead body, is my background's in science and technology studies, bioethics, history of science, sort of the arts, aesthetics, you name it, the whole long list of things. And really, I think when we start talking about death and technology today, there's two things I want to sort of have everyone think about, and I think these are discussion points for the panel tonight. The first is that I think we need to broaden out the whole concept of technology and what we mean when we talk about technology and death, or technology and the dead body. I think you can make a case that in terms of the modern sense of the dead body or death, that one of the key moments in that is actually 17th century, 16th century if you want to make it that, and that was the invention and the use of the autopsy. This idea of self-discovery, or the idea of cutting open the dead body as a site of knowledge and learning and whatever kind of things you can glean from that. And I think that in order to get a better handle on what exactly is this historical phenomena of death that we humans, and here I'll stick largely to the West because that's where we are obsessed with in both understanding as well as defining, I think it's also crucially important that we understand historically how it's all changed. And so historically, how is it that this very concept of death has itself changed in so many different ways that where we land with it today, and that, I mean 2017, is no guarantee that the definition of death we have today will be the definition we have in another 20 years. And that by and large, it's very easy I think, it's very easy to use technological definitions of death in what I think is the other thing that's important to keep in mind, a technologically determinist way of thinking about death, which is it's the technology, when actually it's not really ever the technology, it's how we humans use that technology. And I think we've now crossed a point with all of our advanced technologies in which really the question has not become when do we turn it on, it's become when do we turn it off? When do we turn it off? And I think that was a question that was really brought to us in the 1970s, my favorite decade, around death and dying, and the introduction of reliable, reusable life support machinery. Life support machinery for me has never philosophically, ethically, morally, religiously, you can name every point on that you want, has never really been about when it gets turned on, it's about when it gets turned off. Because as soon as you turn it on, you create that dilemma. And I think now, from the 1970s, we've crossed a kind of new threshold that we're in the middle of. So it's difficult to see because, of course, we're in a forest in the trees kind of moment. Retrospectively, it will become very clear. But that we're at a moment now, I think, in all new kinds of both analog and digital technologies that are overlapping, in which what we're really trying to figure out is when do we shut it down? When do we shut it down? And that's the question we just don't have an answer to right now. Because we also have, at the same time as that question of when do we shut it down, the enlargement of more and more technologies we're turning on. And so that, for me, I think is the question that everyone should be thinking about. And that's 5 minutes and 30 seconds. There we go. All right.
Well
Thank you,
done.
everyone. All right.
So we'll pass on to Louise.
Hello everyone, and Stacy, thank you so much for inviting me to join this panel. So we'd heard a lot about dying, and I'm afraid I represent death here this evening. So one, it's a pleasure actually to work in a building for a change where it's actually designed to do what it's supposed to do, where the technology works, there are screens, there are seats that people can sit on. Because the place that I usually work is the crematorium. And let me tell you, screens do not work if there are even screens. The mics barely function. Oh, this, okay. Okay. Yeah, the mics barely function, and the music systems were installed at some point during the 1980s in most cases. So to just be in this building is a real pleasure. And I deal with terrible design on a daily basis, whether it's orders of service that look like they have been made on Microsoft Paint back in the early 90s, to the ugliest crematoriums you could possibly imagine. So my work has 3 strands. One of the things I do is run a company called Poetic Endings. And I work with the bereaved to put together funerals that are hopefully meaningful and relevant to the life of the person who has died. And that's where I spend most of my time, including this afternoon, at the crematoria, because that's where most funerals take place. Another part of the work that I do is working for something called the Good Funeral Guide, which is a non-for-profit that exists basically to give the funeral industry, as it is at the moment, a bit of a hard time. The funeral industry, I don't know if is anyone here from the funeral industry before I say anything else? Nope, okay. That's typical. Funeral industry people very rarely come to anything to do with death. They don't usually regard it as anything to do with them whatsoever. So the Good Funeral Guide exists to say the things that no one else is saying, to work from the inside out, and originally giving funeral directors a very rough time about pricing and not being transparent about how much funerals cost. But now we've moved on to looking at the way services are taken. We're looking at crematoria and the terrible standards, and giving consumers a voice in an industry which is entirely unregulated. And one of the main things that we do is go around sort of being hotel inspectors for the dead, I guess, and checking out mortuaries and making sure that people are doing what they should be doing, and we try and minimise bad practice as much as possible. Another aspect of my work is public awareness. When I started doing funerals, I became very aware that the point at which I began speaking to people, it was too late. The damage had been done. They had called the local funeral director, who may or may not be a local funeral director in disguise, possibly a big corporate, keeping a family name above the door, and were probably being sold a funeral that they may or may not want. That was not the point to start converting people to dealing with death, grief, funerals, and everything in a totally different way. So some of the work that I do, as you'll see from up here, Life, Death, Whatever, was a festival that ran last year in partnership with the National Trust. And its aim was to get people engaging with death without even realising they were engaging with death. So there were very few coffins, there were very few skulls. It was all about death as the end of life, but as a vital part of life as well. And the National Trust promoted it in quite an interesting way. So we had lots of people coming to the National Trust property, which we'd taken over, to have tea and cake, and actually being subjected to some really quite incredible and subversive death artwork, events, talks, lots of things going on amidst the Tudor panelling of the house that we were in. So all the work I do really is about getting people to deal with death differently. And that doesn't mean that I'm sort of a wedding planner or event planner of funerals. Absolutely not. There's a reason why that role doesn't exist. It wouldn't work in the industry as it stands at the moment. But what I do is work with families to try and come up with something which actually makes the funeral relevant and meaningful and a useful process to go through, as opposed to the very first funeral I ever went to, which is when I was 25, where we spent a huge amount of money, and at the end of it, it was clear it was just a tick box exercise and had become a formality. So I try to not turn the funerals that I'm involved with into formalities.